Bismillah, alhamdulillah, nahmaduhu wa nasta'inuhu wa nastaghfiruh wa nu'minu bihi wa natawakkalu alayhi wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Alhamdulillah, today we're going to continue on with the seerah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And when we left off last week, we were speaking about on the last time we talked, we were on the fourth year of the message of Islam. We were coming to the close of the fourth year, and we spoke about how the persecution against the Muslims was beginning to become more pronounced. Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself was protected because of the connections to his family, his clan of Banu Hashim. But the other Muslims who were not in strong clans, or who were not from Mecca, or who were slaves or former slaves, they began to feel the real brunt of the persecution. The Quraish, the pagan Quraish, could not do much against Prophet Muhammad himself, and they tried to formulate lies against him, but they had run out of many of their excuses and many of the things that they could say about him. One of the attempts to try to bribe Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam was done by Walid ibn al-Mughira, whom I believe was the father of Khalid ibn Walid, the famous general, Muslim general. He wasn't Muslim at the time, but later on he would become the Muslim general. Walid ibn al-Mughira went to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and began to offer him all sorts of different things, saying, "We'll make you our king if that's what you want. We'll give you money. We'll let you marry the best woman that we have. We'll give you whatever you want. Just stop doing this stuff. Just stop preaching this message that you're preaching." And Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam made the famous statement, "If you give me the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left hand, I will still not, stop doing my message, stop spreading the message of Islam." And so Walid ibn al-Mughira had to leave with that, and that pretty much solidified the fact to the Quraysh that they were not going to stop Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam with any non-violent means, at least. So now they had to resort to more harsh and more difficult tactics, and that's when they went after the weaker parts of the small Muslim community at that time. And now we enter into the beginning of the fifth year of the message of Islam, and the Muslims the weaker Muslims are being persecuted quite heavily. We'll speak about two of the more popular stories. These are basically the stories of Bilal ibn Rabah and Ammar ibn Yasir and his family. Bilal ibn Rabah is probably the more famous one. He's known as the muazzin of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Before he became the muazzin, he was a slave. He was a slave to a man named Umayyah ibn Khalaf. Umayyah ibn Khalaf. And Bilal, he became Muslim secretly. And the message came to him from what sources I've read from Abu Bakr. You remember, Abu Bakr was one of the main proponents of Islam, spreading the message first amongst the merchant class, but also to others around Mecca as well. And Bilal became Muslim secretly. He kept it away from the knowledge of his master and his master's family, because his master, Umayyah ibn Khalaf, was one of the chiefs of chiefs of Mecca, and he was one of those who were foremost in the persecution of the Muslims. So Bilal was really caught in a difficult situation. He was, kind of like, you can imagine the difficulty that he was in. He was in a position where his master, a person who had complete control over his life, hated what he believed in and was one of the foremost persecutors and one of the strongest ones against Islam. And Bilal, here he was, no family to protect him, no status or anything, nothing to fall back on. He was the weakest of the weak, a slave at that, and at the same time his master hated his religion. So Bilal was in a very, very difficult position. Eventually his master found out. There are different stories of how he found out. Some people say they walked in on him praying. People walked in on him praying, and the word got out, and somehow or another it got back to Umayyah ibn Khalaf. When Umayyah ibn Khalaf found out, you can imagine how angry he was. He was one of the foremost persecutors of Islam, of the Muslims, and here he is, somebody in his own house or within his own household, even though Bilal wasn't his family or anything like that. Someone within his own household was practicing Islam. So you can imagine, especially the way these guys, where they were with honor and nobility and respect and stuff like that, you can imagine how concerned he was about his reputation and about how foolish he would look, given the fact that here he was talking all this stuff about Muslims and about how Prophet Muhammad SAW is a liar and all these things he's saying, and right within his own household, his own slave is up there praying right under his nose. So you can imagine how upset he was, and so he began to torture Bilal. And the torture is pretty popular. That he whipped him, of course. Let's say popular is well known. The story's been around for obviously hundreds of years. But what we do know is that he whipped him, of course, and whipped him quite badly, physically abused him. And the most famous of the torture is that he took him out into the hot desert of Mecca, tied him down on laying down his back and tied him down. What you call spread eagle, as you saw, tied him down spread eagle, so his legs and hands were all strapped down, and then began to place other slaves, other people place heavy stones on Bilal's chest in this burning heat. You can imagine just trying to be out in the burning heat for an hour or so without having heavy black stones or heavy stones on top of your chest. And this guy did this while Bilal was in the middle of this heated desert, put these heavy stones on his chest. And he would put 2 or 3 stones on his chest at one time. And you just imagine how having heavy stones on your chest at any point in time, even an air-conditioned facility, would be difficult. And here he is doing this in possibly 90, maybe even 100-plus degree weather. Most likely it probably is 100-plus degree weather in the desert out there. So Bilal had to suffer through this, and it wasn't just one time. It was continuous, consistently. Day after day after day. Umayyah ibn Khalaf would do this to Bilal consistently. He would constantly tell Bilal, just renounce Muhammad, renounce Islam, leave Islam, and Bilal would respond by saying Ahad, Ahad, which means one, basically rejecting the many deities of the Quraish and saying there's only one God, Allah, only one. And Bilal's story is very popular amongst Muslims for many reasons. Bilal was not Arab, of course. He was from Ethiopia, what we now know as Ethiopia. Back then it was known as Abyssinia, so he was basically East African. And therefore he was obviously he was much darker skinned than the people around, most people in Mecca. And at that time, the Quraysh had some very racist tendencies amongst them. And they had quite a bit of racism amongst them. So he was seen as a lower class of human being anyway. And so for us Muslims, we see it as an opportunity. We see this as evidence that Islam views all people as equal before the sight of Allah. And this is, of course, echoed in many parts of the Quran and also in the seerah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, how Bilal had a high honor of respect. And so this is an evidence that regardless of how Muslims may act today, and Muslims can be very nationalistic or tribalistic, maybe borderline racist, but it's really more or less tribalistic than actual racism. That's not actually racism where one group really thinks they're better than the others, though that does come up. It's more or less people really just clinging to their own clan or their own family. That's more or less what you see these days. Yeah, a little bit of prejudice may come in, but this is just weaknesses of human beings and individuals. It's not all a weakness of Islam at all. Islam completely speaks out against it. There's a famous line from the Prophet's last sermon when he mentions there's no Arab is greater than non-Arab, and no non-Arab is greater than an Arab, and no black person is greater than a red person. And when they said red at that time, it really meant a Caucasian or person of European descent. And no red person is greater than a black person. So we know that Islam sees all people as equal. Is throughout the Quran, Allah constantly reminds us. Allah doesn't mention anything about how Arabs are better or in any way at all in the Quran. And the Quran is very inclusive of all races. There's nothing in there that really can give any one group of people any sort of superiority over the others. There's no way you can read the Quran unless you really are twisting and really twist the meaning around. No way you can read into the Quran and see anything in the Quran that is anything less than a pluralistic and preaches equality of all humans, regardless of their ethnicity or nationality or anything like that. So Islam is definitely against all these things, but humans are weak, and so then also, Muslims have come into contact with other other societies outside of the Middle East and all, where they already had, as we mentioned, the Quraysh already had their own racist or tribalistic qualities as it is, and all those things weren't necessarily abolished in the time of Islam. It's, while the major companions and those who were true to Islam may have had it, you have millions of people who are Muslim, so there's no way everybody's going to be perfect. And so this stuff has gone on. And even when people then come in contact with the British and the French and even the Americans to a certain extent, some of those things come back in. And so it's just a natural human weakness, but it's nothing to do with Islam in and of itself. But Muslims like to bring up this story because it shows how, the true essence of Islam is that all people are equal in the sight of Allah except for the deeds and their belief. And that's one reason why you'll hear the story quite often with Bilal. And Bilal did go on. Well, let me finish the story of Bilal before we go on to the Ahmad ibn Yasir. With Bilal, eventually the story of his persecution became very popular amongst the Quraish. That is, became very well known. And people were wondering who's going to break first, Umayyah ibn Khalaf or Bilal. And so it became kind of an interesting thing for them to see who's going to crack under the pressure. And people were amazed at how Bilal was able to withhold and withstand the torture that Umayyah ibn Khalaf was putting on him. Eventually, the word got to to Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr came and purchased Bilal ibn Rabah off of Umayyah ibn Khalaf. And once Bilal purchased him, he set him free. And Bilal no longer was under the persecution of Umayyah ibn Khalaf. So, alhamdulillah, Bilal joined the Muslims, and Bilal has a very, he plays an important role throughout Muslim history, throughout the rest of the history of the Prophet Muhammad's life, and on even into the first two Khulafa and times of Caliphs of Abu Bakr and Ammar, radiyallahu anhuma. Bilal will later on become the first muadhin for the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He will participate in many, many battles, including the Battle of Badr and the Battle of Uhud, and many other battles amongst the Muslims. And even when the Muslim empire began to expand beyond just the Arabian Peninsula, he took part in that as well. And Bilal's story is interesting one. But eventually, Bilal dies at about 60 years old, many, many years later, and he's held as one of the first companions, one of the first people to accept Islam. Probably amongst the first 15 to 20 people to accept Islam, and Allah knows best. Definitely amongst the first 40 for sure, but he may even been amongst the first 20 or so, and Allah knows best. And even though it is probably for the next session, not next session, but the next chapter of Seerah, when we go into after the Hijrah, Bilal does get his revenge on his foreign master Umayyah ibn Khalaf after the Muslims make the Hijrah. But we'll get into that, inshallah, once we do the Prophet's life after the Hijrah. The other family, or the other people to be famous story of torture, is that of Ammar ibn Yasir. His family were initially slaves, but they were set free. But because they had formerly been slaves, they were still of a lower strata within the Quraysh system. They weren't originally from the Quraysh themselves anyway, and so they were from a lower social status as being ex-slaves. And this is the way they worked. Even if you were no longer a slave, you still weren't quite equal. Just like in our modern society, a person can be an ex-con, even though they're supposedly equal, they're not still quite equal all the way through. For instance, an ex-con can't vote, and they can't. In most cases in the United States, they can't vote and they can't have weapons either. They're convicted of a felony. And so in Meccan society, it was the same thing. They were considered ex-slaves were considered a lower status. So Ahmad ibn Yasir, his father's name was Yasir, his mother's name was Sumayya. These two were ex-slaves, and because of their former status as slaves, they were still of a lower status in Quraysh society. Eventually, the word got out. They also became Muslim very early on. And eventually, the word got out, and they were tortured by the Banu Makhzum tribe. Banu Makhzum tribe was the same tribe that Abu Jahl belonged to. Remember Abu Jahl, who was perhaps the most prominent enemy of Islam in the beginning. Between him and Abu Lahab, it's kind of hard to figure out who was worse. Allah has cursed Abu Lahab in the Quran, so maybe Abu Lahab is worse. Allah knows best, but they were both pretty bad. Abu Jahl, he persecuted the entire family. Yasir, his father and his mother. Ammar and Ammar's mother, Sumayya. he persecuted all three of them. Eventually, Yasir he was an older man. His son, Ammar himself was probably in his 30s, maybe pushing his 40s by this time. So you consider his father was not really young either. He was probably at least 50 to 60 years old. And so Yasir, he died just from the torture in itself. The torture was just so much that he eventually just died from out of torture. And Sumayya, she lasted a little bit longer, but she was eventually, as the stories say, Abu Jahl just basically impaled her on a spear and ran a spear through her and killed her with that, even after all the torture. And so Ammar ibn Yasir, he sees his two parents lying before him, dead and murdered, and now Abu Jahl comes to him, basically saying that, well, you're next if you don't give up what you believe. And Ammar ibn Yasir, he denounces Prophet Muhammad ﷺ to save his life in order not to be killed, and he basically says that he doesn't believe, or he denounces Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, says he's a liar, and he does this to escape the torture. So he's freed from that. You can imagine now. I mean, obviously everyone knows that he's being tortured, and so I don't think anyone will have a negative opinion of him. But in case somebody is foolish enough to have a negative opinion of him, you can imagine the shock he was going through. You can imagine your loved ones, your mother and father, being tortured to death before your very eyes for days and days and days at a time, and then being killed. So you really can't blame him for what he's done. None of us have seen anyone being out. I'm sure none of us have seen anyone being tortured. But now, not just seeing a human being being tortured, but the two people you love you love the most, your mother and your father, being tortured to death before your very eyes. I mean, that's not something that anyone should judge him for. He went back to Prophet Muhammad ﷺ after they freed him, after he renounced Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. He went back to him crying and told Prophet Muhammad ﷺ what happened. And the Prophet ﷺ asked him, well, what do you believe in your heart? And he said, my belief has not changed. I'm still Muslim. I still believe in you. I still believe you brought the truth. And Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told him, well, if they do that again, then say the same thing. In other words, if you have to save your life with this, then do the same thing. And this comes to the phrase in the Quran, "Fattaqullaha mastata'tum." Fear Allah as much as you can. So Allah has given us ease in certain situations where we can do something that would normally be haram. To curse Prophet Muhammad ﷺ or to say he's a liar is obviously haram. It's a death penalty under classical Sharia. Under Sharia law, that's death penalty right there. To renounce Islam or to say the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is a liar, that's a reason to be put to death in Islamic government. But here's a case where under certain circumstances, one can still break this commandment or break this law in order to save life or limb. And so this is just an example of the flexibility of Islam. Even something as terrible as this, which we may consider, close to, which is like shirk in normal circumstances. This would be considered shirk, or at least radda, leaving Islam. Yet, this is allowed to save a life. And Allah knows best how much a person can do and can take. Some people may have been able to hold out longer. Some people may have given up after the first whip, after the first lash on the back, they may have given up. Allah knows best. And we can only be grateful that we are not put to that kind of torture. And may Allah protect us from that, because we never know how we may fare under the same circumstances. So those are two of the more popular persecutions of weaker Muslims within the Meccan society, within the Quraish society. Now, this is now the 5th year of the Hijrah, and now, these are the two more popular stories, but there are many, many other Muslims. Remember, most of the Muslims, even though we mentioned some of the more prominent companions like Abu Bakr and Uthman ibn Affan and Abdurrahman ibn Auf, who, these are more the prominent Muslims who were part of that merchant class in Mecca, who were able to avoid much of this persecution. They experienced some of it, but they did not receive anything like Bilal and Ammar ibn Yasir and his family received. They didn't get anything that badly. But you can see how, but other than those few individuals, most of the Muslims at that time were from the lower society of Meccan society, lower status and lower ranks of Meccan society. But many of their stories are not really known or spoken of as yet. But definitely these two were the most famous stories. So now the Muslims began to ask Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when will Allah's help come? When will this torture and persecution end? So we're going through almost an entire year now of persecution, throughout the entire 5th year now. Now 5 years after the first verses came to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq came. The first verse, after those first verses that come now, we're now getting to the point where, we're now 5 years afterwards. And the Muslims, again, they get to a point where they have to try to think of some way to get out of this situation, some way to address the situation. They ask Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam questions like, when will Allah's help come? When can we be saved from this persecution, from this torture? And, for those of them who were protected by the family, they don't know when their own family will turn against them. And as a matter of fact, many of the Muslims were persecuted by their own families. Even those who were not from the lower classes of Muslim society, they were persecuted by their own families. Ammar ibn Khattab, before he became Muslim, he persecuted the members of his family who were Muslim, or the slaves under his family's control who were Muslim. He whipped them and tortured them to give up their Islam. And this is what all of them did, because they couldn't basically cross-torture other people, because, basically the idea was, no one's going to persecute my family but me. No one's going to torture my family but me. They couldn't torture each other's family, but they could torture the ones within their own family. So those people who were within their own, those people who were against Islam, they would torture the Muslims within their own family. There are many stories of this. Abu Bakr was tortured or persecuted, or really more or less beaten. Not really tortured, he's beaten by his own family. There are others. I think Mu'adh ibn Jabal, I can't remember the name, but one of the companions named Mu'adh, I don't think it's Ibn Jabal, it's another one. I can't remember the name right now. But he was also tortured by his family. And there are quite a few others who were tortured by their own family, by their own clan, because they couldn't really go across to other clans and get them. And even Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even though he was protected from a lot of the problems, he also experienced some torture. For instance, we of course know that Abu Lahab, who was within his own family, him and his wife would of course do verbal abuse, but his wife also would put thorns in the Prophet's path in the front of his door to just make his life a little more difficult than it already was. There are stories of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam making sajdah or making prayer at the Kaaba, and then one of the I think it's Ikramah or Abu Jahl, I can't remember. They put the uterus or dead fetus of a camel on his neck while he was making sajdah, and his daughter Fatima came and started yelling at them and fussing him and threw it off of him. And have these sort of things, but just more or less annoyances, because they couldn't really come out strong against Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because the family was one of the perhaps the most noble family in Quraish, and he still had some protection. And so they really just couldn't go ahead and get him directly. But all the others, though, he still experienced some pain and some torture. And the others, some of them actually did attack him physically. And we'll get into that probably in the next class. I don't know if we have time for this class, but we'll get into that soon in the next class. We talk about the conversions of Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib and Ammar ibn Khattab. When we talk about their conversions, we'll go into a little bit more of some of the persecution that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam faced himself directly. So now within the 5th year, now the Muslims had to find a way out, and Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam suggested that some of the Muslims who were willing to migrate to Abyssinia, which we now know of as I mentioned earlier, as modern day Ethiopia. So he suggested some of the Muslims make this migration to this hijrah or migration to Abyssinia. And the reason why he suggested Abyssinia was because he knew they had a just king, and that king was also a Christian. Abyssinia, or Ethiopia then as now, is primarily a Christian nation. Now it's maybe 60% Christian, 30% Muslim. But back then it's probably 100% Christian. Allah knows best. But they practice a different form of Christianity that we're mostly familiar with. They practice Coptic Christianity. They're mostly Coptic Christians. And the Christianity they practice is more similar to Greek Orthodox Christianity, which is practiced in Greece, but also Russia and other places like that. So it's different from the Christianity that we're used to in the West, which is mostly Christianity that branched off from Roman Catholicism. So either whether it's Protestant Christianity or Catholicism, it all basically has like a Western form of Christianity that we're mostly used to in the United States and other parts of United States, Western Europe, and Canada, places like that. And then most of the Western Hemisphere, we're familiar with either Catholicism or Protestantism, however you say it. We're mostly familiar with that. Whereas in Ethiopia, Egypt, Russia, the Balkans, Greece, places like that, they practice more of a Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and that is also similar to what there's also something similar to what the Ethiopians or the Abyssinians at that time practiced, and they have a different year where whereas here in the West we know the year is now 2013. Supposedly, we know that's not true, but supposedly, 2013 years after, we'll say, the disappearance of Isa ibn Maryam. But Orthodox Christians, they have a different, their year, the way they count the years is different. So I forgot whether it's, 500 years more or less, but it's slightly different from the year that we have now. So it wouldn't be 2013 according to their calendar. But going on now. So the Prophet suggested that some of the Muslims traveled to Abyssinia to escape some of the persecution. And many of the Muslims did go, about 16 went, and included 12 men and 4 women. Amongst them were, as we mentioned, Uthman ibn Affan. He was one of those who went over, as well as Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who was a brother to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and therefore he was a cousin of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He also went as well. So these 16 Muslims migrated to Abyssinia and set up camp there, inshallah. Basically try to, not really spread Islam, but try to live or practice Islam where they were in peace without having to be persecuted or not knowing when their family's going to turn against them. Amazingly, the Quraish weren't happy with this. It's like they didn't want them practicing Islam in their country or within their borders of their city, but once they leave, they're not happy with that either. And so I don't know if Allah knows best, and maybe they were worried that the word would get out and make them look bad. Maybe they didn't want any sort of bad publicity going out about Mecca and about Mecca and the Quraysh. Allah knows best, but they weren't happy with the Muslims even leaving their nation. You would think that, as we have in America, people say love it or leave it. When people want to bring up objections to some of the things that U.S. government does, or something that they may object to that the U.S. government does, one common refrain people use is love it or leave it. Meaning, if you don't like it, then go find somewhere else to live. But when the Muslims tried the same thing in Mecca, the Quraysh were totally against it, and so they had to find some way to get them back. And so they sent, one of their best diplomats, Ammar ibn al-As, to go get them back. Ammar ibn al-As is one of the most interesting characters of the early Muslims. He is like a politician amongst Muslims. He is one of the most fascinating and interesting characters from a historical point of view. He is really an amazing character. He was the governor of Egypt 3 different times. He is really amazing how especially after the death of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and in the many different struggles of the Khulafa and stuff like that, the role he played is very, very interesting. So his name will probably come up a little bit more if we once we go into the next session, which we talk about after the Hijrah. By the next session, I don't mean next week. Once we finish before the Hijrah, which I consider one session of the seerah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then we go on to the next session, which will be another 4 or 5, however months that takes. Allah knows best. But my point is this: Ammar ibn al-As, if you can do some research on him on your own, that's all well and good if you want to. But this is a very fascinating character. In any case, he was also from amongst that merchant class of Meccan society, but he did not accept Islam. Not at first, at least. He did eventually, much later on, but at first he did not accept Islam. But because he was a merchant, he traveled all over, and he was a very good diplomat, a very good politician. He had connections with many different world leaders from around the the area at the time. He had connections with the Byzantines, with the Egyptians, with the Abyssinians, of course, with all the different tribes of Arabia. He was just a well-connected guy. You can imagine somebody like this now in our modern time, somebody who seems, you're talking about somebody, oh yeah, I know that guy. Or you say, yeah, I know the guy. I got a connection to this guy. Somebody who's well-connected. If you get to his cell phone records, or look through his phone book, you'll see that he has veritable who's who of modern society. Well, Ahmad ibn As was that kind of person. He really was just well connected with the powers that be of his era. So the Quraysh decided to send Ahmad ibn As to go and sweet talk or convince the king of Abyssinia. And the title of the king of Abyssinia at that time was called Negus, which is spelled Negus or Nejus, different ways. In Arabic, it's pronounced An-Najashi, and that's usually how he's called. And most of the hadith, he's usually referred to as An-Najashi, which is really a title. That's not his name, but it's really the title An-Najashi is really just his a title, basically. Like king, or like Caesar for the Romans, or Tsar for Russians and stuff like that. In any case, so Ahmad ibn As, he travels to Abyssinia to convince the king of Abyssinia, An-Najashi, to return these immigrants, these refugees in his country, back to Mecca where they belong. So he comes here, he brings a whole bunch of gifts. He knows An-Najashi very well. He's been to Abyssinia many times on trading missions. So he brings all these gifts to kind of sweeten the deal and to, help win An-Najashi over to his side. And he comes and presents his case before Najashi. Says, you are holding these refugees, these people who have come from our city, and they follow this doctrine that causes them that is causing friction in our land. It causes family to turn against family. It is one of the worst things that has happened at all in the history of Arabia. And he's just saying all these bad things about these Muslims, about the Muslims who migrated to Abyssinia. He says, and on top of all that, they're not even Christian. So he's really trying to work it on. An-Najashi. He said, not only do they disbelieve what we believe in, they don't even believe in what you believe in. They say that that Jesus is not part of the Trinity. They say that Maryam is not divine. That you can't pray to Maryam. So they don't follow what you practice either. They don't follow the Bible. And so An-Najashi now, rather than have a knee-jerk reaction and call his soldiers and say, round up all these Arab immigrants and send them back home to where they came from, he calls them to his court to get their side of the story. And so the Muslims come, all of them who were part of the immigrant society. There was one actually who, I can't remember his name. He moved to Abyssinia as an immigrant and wound up converting to Christianity, actually, and staying there. His wife, and I can't remember her name for the life of me, but his wife, she had to divorce him because he was no longer Muslim. When she came back, she eventually became a wife of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and I can't remember the name right now. I don't want to say the wrong one. Well, I'll say later. But it happened many, many years later that they got married. But for right now, just so you know that one of the people who did go to Abyssinia wound up becoming Christian. And something to think about, don't become so, even though it is upsetting to hear someone who leaves Islam, and it upsets me too when I hear about someone leaving Islam. Just know that it happened during the Prophet's time, with all these things happening all around them, and all the miracles, the moon splitting, and the Quran coming down, and all these things happening around them, and people still left Islam. It was a very small number, but some people did. Then what can we say about now, when the anti-Islam propaganda is a very well-oiled machine, when I won't say anti-Islam, but when there's the sophistication of missionary work is at such a high levels, the sophistication of Christian missionaries is very remarkable and actually pretty admirable, actually. If you can, take away the fact we don't believe in what they're saying, but just look at how well organized they are in their missionary work and how well they do it. I mean, there's something that amazing that we're able to, we don't convert anyone. Allah brings people's hearts, but the fact that so many people come into Islam with, considering the fact we'd have nothing compared to what, Christian missionaries who are active in missionary work have, the things they're able to do, we can't even come close to that. And so evidently, if people are becoming Christian now, or people becoming Christian then, evidently people will become Christian now actually also with, like I said, the sophistication of missionary work that they have right now is really good. And from as far as respecting the way it's done, not actually respecting, the fact that they do it. We don't support what they're doing, but just the fact that they are very good at what they're doing. They're very organized and very well trained, and in some cases they're pretty effective as well. But the point is that one of the companions, even at that time, did accept Christianity. Now, An-Najashi has all the Muslims brought back to his court so they can give their side of the story. And they choose Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, who was Ali ibn Abi Talib's brother, to be their spokesperson. So he comes forward and An-Najashi starts asking him all these questions and saying, is this true and is that true? And Ja'far, he gives his responses, and eventually he quotes a line from Surah Maryam and talking about the commonality between the Muslims and Christians as well, and the belief of Isa alayhi salam. And I don't have the verse in front of me right now, but after he recites the verse, the verses and the translation is given to the An-Najashi. I don't know if he spoke Arabic or not. Allah knows best if he did. But however, once they heard it, once An-Najashi and the people in his court heard it, they were all crying because they were all devout Christians, and they could see the commonality between what they believed and what Muslims believed. And as the story goes, An-Najashi drew a line in the ground with a stick and says that this is all that separates our two faiths. And then he told Ibn As to take your presents and go. And he told the Muslims that you're welcome to stay here as long as you desire. And so Ahmad ibn As had to go back to Mecca basically empty-handed. He was not able to, despite being the great politician and diplomat that he was, he did not succeed in this point. He was not able to bring back the Muslim refugees. Now, around the same time that we're going back to Mecca now, and back in Mecca now, around the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Surotokaf to Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is still within the 5th year of the Hijrah. And Allah reveals Surotokaf. And without going into the stories of why Surotokaf was revealed, because there's disagreement about whether the stories are authentic or not, the point I want you to really consider is the story of Surotokaf. Surotokaf is, and it's a chapter of the cave, 18th chapter of the Quran. It is one of the, there are many attributes and many virtues of this surah, and we'll go over some of the virtues soon. I don't want to get too much into the tafsir of this surah, but I do want to discuss the 3 different stories, the 3 popular stories. There's really 4 stories within Surotokaf, but really 3 of them are very relevant to the seerah of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The first one is the story of the companions of the cave, Ashabul Kahf. And this is the story of where this is during the time of Christians, before Islam, before Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam came, the message of Islam. There were many, there was a Christian nation, it probably wasn't Christian, most likely Jewish, but it was a nation that was supposed to follow the teachings of Isa alayhi salam. But the king of that nation, he began to divert, and he wanted to go off the path of the teaching of Jesus alayhi salam. And he began to force his people to follow something else. And there were some young men who lived in this area, who lived within this society, who wanted to stick firm to the true belief of the teachings of Jesus alayhi salam. And so they refused to follow the king's orders to worship whatever he wanted them to worship. He refused to follow his orders. And the king gave them some time to think about it, but basically was they did not change their mind. They were going to be either killed or jailed or harmed in some sort of way. And so what they had to do was they had to leave the city, leave this area, this town that they were living in, and they took refuge inside of a cave. And as the surah goes, Allah sent down a miracle in which he put them to sleep for several years. Some say 300 years. The Quran belief says 309 years. 309 years. So Allah put them to sleep for 309 years within this cave. And despite the fact that they were sleeping for 309 years, they did not die. Their bodies did not decay. They did not turn to bones or anything like that. They were just here, hidden in this cave, and no one could see them for 309 years. And eventually, when they woke up 300 plus years later, and they come out, the situation had completely changed. So where before they were an oppressed minority, they come out now, and the king before has died. The situation has changed. Now everybody is pretty much practicing the teachings of Jesus alayhi salam. They're now practicing, what at that time is Islam, or true submission to Allah through the teachings of Jesus alayhi salam. And so now things have changed, and this is just an example. It correlates with the story of the people of the Muslims traveling to Abyssinia in order to escape the persecution of the Quraish. How these young men had to get up and leave their town in order to escape their persecution, or the possible persecution, or the threat of persecution from their people. And it is also known that this surah, there are many attributes to this surah in which we are even commanded by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or advised by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that if we are alive when the Dajjal, Al-Masih ad-Dajjal, the Antichrist comes, if we are alive during that time, we should seek protection from Allah by reciting the first 10 and or the last 10 verses of the surah. I suggest you memorize them both. And also, interestingly enough, in the 10th verse of Surotokaf, there is a dua which these young men recited. For the first 9 verses of Surotokaf, Allah is pretty much just giving Prophet Muhammad some comfort and helping him understand that, you're not going to be able to guide every single person to Islam. Allah controls that, and Allah is giving him comfort. But in the 10th verse now, the story of the people of the cave begins. Well, it really begins in the 9th verse. But in the 10th verse, Allah mentions a dua that the people of the cave, the companions of the cave, those young men who left their people to escape the threat of persecution. And Allah says, بَعْدَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ إذ أوى الفتية إلى الكهف فقالوا ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. When the youths retreated to the cave and said, Our Lord, grant us from yourself mercy and prepare for us from our affair righteous guidance. So this is a dua that they said when they were, facing persecution. And then Allah goes into the story of how He put them to sleep and then brings them back 300 years later. The next story of Surotokaf, which is of importance, is a story between Prophet Musa alayhi salam and Khidr. And, this is a story in which, we've got to refer to the hadith first of all, and then relate it back to the surah. In the hadith, when Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam explains the surah, he explains how Musa alayhi salam, during his lifetime, he was the prophet and the leader of his people, Bani Israel. Someone asked him, who is the most knowledgeable person? And Prophet Musa alayhi salam, being a prophet, and as far as his information, as far as what he knew, as far as what his knowledge knew, he said, well, I am. Because he was a prophet, and it's not his fault for assuming that if he's receiving revelation from Allah, that he would assume that he's probably the most knowledgeable person on the earth at that time. And so Allah wanted to show him that there may be other people, and there were other people who had knowledge that he did not have. And Allah is the one who controls how much knowledge a person has and how knowledgeable a person has and all this sort of thing. It's nothing, and then not that Musa was becoming arrogant, but just to show Musa a lesson. So Allah guided him to go find this person named Al-Khidr, which means the green one as the story goes, and to learn from him. The story is very, very popular, so I'm just going to breeze through it. I would suggest if you're not familiar with the story, then go read chapter 18 of Surotokaf and read it, and read the tafsir behind it. Really beautiful surah in and of itself, and the rhythm is very beautiful. All of the verses tend to end with ahada or rashada, ghadda, and things like that. So it's a very beautiful surah as far as the rhythm is concerned, but also the meaning is very beautiful as well. But just to quickly go through the story of Musa and Al-Khidr, Musa finally meets up with Al-Khidr, and he wants to learn from him. And Khidr is saying, you will not have patience with me. you're not patient with me, and you're going to ask too many questions. And at first, Khidr didn't want to take him on as a student, so to speak. But eventually, he relents, and Musa alayhi salam promises to be patient and not to ask any questions until Khidr gives him permission to. But he goes along with them, and the first thing they do is they come across, while they're traveling, they come across this boat, and the people on the boat knew Khidr, and they had to get across a sea or a river, and so they get on the boat and they're getting ready to go across the river, and then once they get on, Khidr he damages the boat. He takes an axe and damages the boat so that it's unable to travel. And Musa alayhi salam sees this, and he's like, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this? These people, they give you a ride, they help you out, and then you go and destroy the boat. This is their means of livelihood." And Khidr tells them, "Didn't I say you won't be able to have patience with me? Didn't I say you won't be able to hold back and not ask me any questions?" And Musa alayhi salam, he relents and says, "Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not going to, won't ask any more questions anymore." And then they go off on their travels. They leave the boat and they go on their travels, and then they come across a young boy playing, and Khidr goes up to the boy and kills the boy. And now Musa is really like, okay, now this destroying the boat is one thing, but now you're going to kill a young man who hasn't done anything. And as a verse says, "A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. فانطلقا حتى إذا لقيا غلاما فقتله قال أقتلت نفسا زكية بغير نفس لقد جئت شيئا نكرا." So they set out until when they met a boy, and Khidr killed him. And Musa alayhi salam said, "Have you killed a pure and innocent soul for no other reason? And so you have certainly done a deplorable thing." And then Khidr responds, قال ألم أقل لك إنك لن تستطيع معي صبرا. He said, "Did I not tell you that with me you will not be able to have patience?" And so Musa relents again, and he's patient some more. And then the next time they come across a town, and they ask for help in the town, and nobody wants to help them. And the two of them, they're very hungry. Musa and Khidr, they're very hungry. And so eventually, though, they come across a wall that's close to falling down. And so Khidr, he fixes the wall back up so it doesn't fall down. And Musa, trying to maybe perhaps straddle the line, not, knowing he's already messed up twice, he offers a suggestion, said, perhaps if you really wanted to, you could have asked these people, for some sort of payment. Since they haven't been able to help, they weren't willing to help us, maybe you should have asked for some sort of payment or some sort of reward for what you were doing. And Khidr's okay, that's it between you and I, we're done. And so he begins to give him the wisdom behind the actions that he's taken. And I encourage you to go read the surah and find out the rest, because it's going to take I don't want to give a whole seerah about it, but the point is that this, in relation to the situation the Muslims were going through at that time, is showing the Muslims that, things may be happening in front of our eyes that look one way, basically from what we can see, but behind it all, many other things may be happening. Allah has a different plan for many other things, and that our wisdom of what we are seeing right now, it can totally change later on. One example, I'll give this quick example before moving on. I probably will go over my 1 hour today. Can't go too, or I gotta go to work. But anyway, during the time of the Middle Ages, the Muslim world was ravaged by the Mongols. And the Mongols were conquering the Muslim world and killing millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of Muslims. And the Muslims, could not hold a candle to them. I mean, the Muslims were not able to resist the Mongols at all. And the Mongols just swept through Baghdad, killed like almost 1 million people in Baghdad, killed the Khalifa of all people, killed him, and just kept pushing on through. Got all the way to the doorstep of Egypt. They got all the way to Palestine, conquered Palestine, as a matter of fact. Got all the way to the doorstep of Egypt. So you can see how far they had gotten through. They had conquered what was, India, Central Asia of Afghanistan, on through what we now know of as Iraq and Iran, and all the way through the Northern Arabia Peninsula. And they were threatening to go down into Mecca and Medina, but they never quite got that far. But they were threatening to it. Got all the way to Palestine, on the border of Egypt. They're getting ready to go into Egypt. And Allah knows best, had they gone into Egypt, there's probably not much the Mamluks who were ruling Egypt at the time could have done. They would have probably gone ahead and got conquered Egypt too also, and who knows how far they would have gone. But Allah caused the leader to die, and that stopped the conquest for that period of time. Now, at that point in time, I'm pretty sure the Muslims thought that this was the end of the world. I mean, we're talking about the end of the world now, and the most you can say if you want to consider conquering, two fairly weak Muslim nations, Iraq and Afghanistan, that have been quote unquote conquered, even though they're quite technically being run by Muslims, supported by Western money. We know how the deal is. But still, we can only say that two nations have been conquered. Whereas this thing, thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands of Muslims were killed, and nothing was stopping the Mongol approach. And so at that point in time, you can imagine how devastated they were. We consider ourselves as being devastated right now because of all the things that are happening in the world right now. But we're not facing anything like what they faced in the Middle Ages. And they thought that was the end of the world. They thought that this was, the Mongols were the Al-Juj al-Ma'ajuj, Gog and Magog coming. And they weren't, obviously, because here we are now almost 1,000 years later, and the world is still spinning. So that wasn't it, obviously. But, they thought it was, and righteously so. You could imagine they were. But with these people who came and conquered all this nation, eventually, the grandson or the cousin of the ruler, not Genghis Khan himself, but one of his sons, who was doing all this conquering, he wanted to becoming Muslim himself. Even after his ancestors had killed thousands of Muslims, he wanted to becoming Muslim himself. And these very people who conquered and killed so many Muslims wanted becoming Muslim themselves. And so it just so goes to show that, things happen on the surface that we may not understand, or it looks really, really bad on the surface, yet underneath it all, something good may be happening, or something good may come up of it. Maybe not right now, may not come out in our lifetime. We may not even understand it until the day of judgment, until we're before Allah and Allah reveals everything and informs of all these things. We may not ever know in our lifetime, but there's good to these things that happen. And it's a matter of just putting our trust in Allah and understand, and basically, understand the verse when Allah says, "Ma asaba fi musibatin illa bi'idhnillah." Nothing happens of bad nothing happens at all except by the will of Allah. So teaching us to put our trust in Allah. And we don't have time to go into the last story, but it's based the story of Dhul Qarnayn and Al-Juj al-Ma'juj, and just goes on to the, I just mentioned a little bit of them there, but we don't really have time to go into right now. There's one more point I wanted to make before opening up for questions. There was another surah being revealed around this time, towards the end of the 5th year of the Hijrah and the beginning of the 6th year. Allah sent down another surah. This was Suratul Najm. And Suratul Najm is, once again, typical Meccan surah in the fact that the verses are mostly calling people to worship Allah, calling people to believe in the hereafter. Very short verses. All the verses pretty much rhyme. Not much. I don't think there's any like hukum, or I don't say hukum, hudud. No laws being passed in this verse, in this surah. I gotta read through it again. I haven't read it recently, but I don't think there's any verses of law being put down in this surah. But the point of this surah, first we're going to talk about the revelation in of itself, and then we're going to talk about some of the ramifications of that revelation and how it affects our modern life. Surah An-Najm, it was revealed while Prophet Muhammad was making prayer at the Kaaba, and Surah An-Najm means the star, by the way, and it's named so because the first verse says Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَالنَّجْمِ إِذَا هَوَى مَا ضَلَّ صَاحِبُكُمْ وَمَا غَوَى وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَى إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيٌ يُوحَى. By the star when it descends. So this is Allah swearing upon the star. And as I may have mentioned it before, but Allah can and does swear upon anything that he wants to upon his creation, within his creation. And so Allah sometimes swears by the night, and so by the sun, by the star, in this case, by the moon. Sometimes he swears by himself. Sometimes he swears by all sorts of different things. We, however, as Muslims, we can only swear by Allah. We cannot swear upon the star or anything like that. And, that's shirk. So Allah can do this stuff, but we can't. We have to only swear by Allah. Your companion has not strayed, nor has he erred, nor does he speak from his own inclination, but it is not but a revelation revealed. And so then, once again, just Allah confirming to the Quraish that Prophet Muhammad was speaking the truth. Now, according to the story of the seerah, is that when this surah came down, the pagans who were at the Kaaba and watching Prophet Muhammad pray and receive the revelation, when Prophet Muhammad began to recite the surah, something came over them where they were compelled. Towards the end of the surah, there's a verse of Sajdah. And the verse of Sajdah, I forgot how many there are. I think about 9 or so in the Quran. The verse of Sajdah, it is sunnah to make Sajdah when we hear these verses, whether we're praying or whether we're not praying. It's sunnah to make Sajdah, to go down to prostration when we hear these verses. Towards the end of this surah, there is a prostration also. And when Prophet Muhammad recited this verse of prostration, everybody, not just Prophet Muhammad himself, but even all of the pagans themselves, they also prostrated as well. It's like they were compelled to do so against their will, or not against their will, but something came over them where they did it, and they did not accept Islam afterwards, but the recitation was so great that they couldn't help but do it. Okay, and so with that, when that happened, and the word got out amongst the Quraish in the Mecca that the people of who were listening to it around the Kaaba, and some of them were actually the chiefs of the Quraysh, they prostrated as well. When the word got out, a rumor began to spread that the people of Mecca had accepted Islam, and that rumor found its way back to Abyssinia, and the Muslims of Abyssinia heard this, who had made that migration. They heard this, and thinking that things had changed, many of them, they headed back to Mecca. But of course, when they got there, nothing had really changed. In fact, the persecution had actually gotten worse than before. But we'll speak about that in the next class, inshallah. What I want to talk about right now before we close off is within this surah, there are a few verses here. I'll recite the verses right now. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. أفرأيتم اللات والعزى ومناة الثالثة الأخرى ألكم الذكر وله الأنثى تلك إذا قسمة ضيزى. Some of the early biographies of Prophet Muhammad, when I say early, it's still about 300 years after his death, or 300 years after the Hijrah, I should say. But some of the early seerahs, they quoted weak and fabricated hadiths that said that Prophet Muhammad had inserted a couple of verses in. Well, let me first give you the translation of these verses. The translation of them is, so have you considered Allat and Al-Uzza? These are the names of two pagan deities that the Quraish used to worship. And Manat, that's another deity, the third, the other one, is the male for you, and for him, meaning Allah, the female. That then is an unjust division. So with this, some fabricated hadiths or weak hadiths were inserted into some of the early biographies of Prophet Muhammad, saying that, Prophet Muhammad, in an attempt to encourage the Quraysh to come into Islam, he slipped in some praise of their deities, their pagan idols, to try to win some of the Quraysh over to his side. And that when this happened, Allah then sent an angel to rebuke Prophet Muhammad for doing that. Remember, these are all fabricated hadiths. I'm not quoting this as being actual history. This is all fabricated or weak hadiths. That, an angel came down and said that he wasn't supposed to do that. And so these verses were abrogated. Now, for hundreds and hundreds of years, probably close to 1,000 years, very few people even knew about this story. I mean, hardly anybody ever really thought about it. First of all, they all came from weak hadiths, and most of the scholars had pretty much, rejected all these stories, said that they weren't true, and so. But they were in some of the early seerahs, and some scholars for instance, At-Tabari, he had an inclination to be very encyclopedic in his work, and he's a great scholar. May Allah have mercy on him. He's a great scholar, but he would include all sorts of stuff inside of his seerah and also inside of his tafsir. He was like doing a tafsir, like encyclopedia of his tafsir and his seerah. He included all sorts of information, both authentic and inauthentic. Mostly because, not necessarily because, he didn't know the difference, but mostly because he wanted to basically give all the information he could about any particular topic he was discussing. And so some of these weak or fabricated hadiths wound up inside of his seerah and his tafsir as well. But like I said, his stuff he's still a very prominent scholar, and he's still, may Allah have mercy for all the work that he's done for Islam. However, At-Tabari lived about 300 years after the Hijrah, so even you can see that he was many years after the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu time. Now, the point of it all, like I said, most scholars had really, disavowed most of these stories, and it was not really known within the vast majority of the Muslim society until the 1980s came around. In the 1980s, a pretty much unknown Indian author, but who was educated in England, in Britain, he published a novel called the Satanic Verses. And this novel didn't really make too many waves at all. Nobody really knew about this novel at all. But within this novel, he basically fictionalized this whole account. We just spoken about these weak and fabricated hadiths, saying that Prophet Muhammad inserted these verses to, convince the Quraish of his time to come on over to Islam, and then he took it out later on after Allah, corrected him. So he fictionalized this whole thing, and I never read his book, so disclaimer there. I only read, what other people said about it, and I'm not going to read his book. I don't encourage you to read his book either. However, for almost a year or so after the publication of his book, nobody knew anything about his book. So nobody knew about the stories of, these fabricated or weak hadiths, of talking about this incident that never happened. Nobody even knew about this fictional story that, that Salman Rushdie wrote, that, he was a fairly unknown author at the time. Nobody even knew about those either. But word eventually got back to the leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini. He found out about the this book publishing, the story of this book being published by Salman Rushdie. And Ayatollah Khomeini basically put a warrant on Salman Rushdie's life, giving $4 million to anyone who would kill him, something like that. $4 million. I think it was about $4 million to anyone who would kill Salman Rushdie for saying evil things. The story of the verse is just one part of that book. There are many other evil things that this guy put in his book beyond that. But Ayatollah Khomeini basically put a warrant out on his head saying anyone who kill him will get $4 million. So Salman Rushdie had to go into hiding in the UK. When that happened, then all of a sudden the news got out and the media jumped on it, because the Western media, Western world didn't really like Ayatollah Khomeini to begin with. It didn't like Iran to begin with anyway. They took the story and ran with it. And this book that no one even was buying suddenly became a bestseller and sold out everywhere. This story of these verses that no one, even Muslims, hardly ever heard of, became very popular and became all over the place. And this was just one more spoke in the wheel of Muslims shooting themselves in the foot by overreacting to stuff. And when this happened, Salman Rushdie became kind of like a hero amongst the quote unquote freedom of speech people and the people who didn't like Islam or Muslims to begin with. These gave him some more ammunition, how Muslims are against freedom of speech and they want to kill this guy for writing a story and all this other stuff. It made Salman Rushdie very popular and very rich. And he wound up renouncing Islam anyway. He wound up, he believes in some sort of universal religion type thing, basically. He was quote unquote, I guess, Muslim to begin with, but right now, I'm pretty sure he's not Muslim now. He's on some other crazy kick. But the point is just that, sometimes we overreact to things and we shoot ourselves in the foot. Same thing with the cartoons in 2005 that came in that Danish newspaper. I mean, until Muslims started taking to the streets and burning flags and attacking embassies and stuff, nobody knew about those cartoons. If we had just completely ignored those things, the rest of the world would have ignored those things. And we make this big fuss about this stuff, and it gets all over the news. And now the cartoons are all over the internet. Now even though most major news networks like CNN and a couple others won't show it out of respect, is kind of ridiculous because it's all over the news. It's all over the internet anyway. You can type in Prophet Muhammad cartoons, it'll come up in a second. And it's all over the internet, and so it makes us look bad once again. Shows us being a bunch of wild, violent people who are against, freedom of speech. And so, of course, they show all the protests and everything of, I think that has President Bush being burned in effigy, and American flags or Danish flags being burnt, and people attacking embassies and all sorts of stuff. And a whole bunch of Muslims died in all these crazy violence and riots anyway. Happened again last year with the release of that YouTube movie, that silly YouTube movie. I forgot what it's called. Honor of Muslim Death. I forgot what it's called. Whatever the heck it's called. The YouTube movie came out. It had been out for a long time before that. I forgot how long, maybe a year or so even before it became news. But then it's quote unquote gets out, and according to the story, the media, I don't know if all this stuff is true, but people attack the Libyan embassy and kill a U.S. diplomat and all this other stuff. And once again, more stuff to make Muslims look bad. Very often we are really our own worst enemy sometimes. We really do some dumb stuff to ourselves. And you can say that people are that we're being provoked by non-Muslims and all, but really we are a little more intelligent in our reactions to some of these things. It's like people know exactly what to do to get us to act like fools. And we make it easy for ourselves sometimes by doing these silly things. Okay, but just want to give you the story of the Satanic Verses so you know about it and know how it relates to the story of Prophet Muhammad. The Satanic Verses don't exist because there were no Satanic Verses. Okay, they don't exist. These are all from weak and fabricated hadiths. And I already told you about how At-Tabari, one of the early biographers, he was still 300 years after Prophet Muhammad, after the Hijrah. He's 300 years after the Hijrah. So even at his time, he was still several generations separated from Prophet Muhammad. Yet, and he was a person who included all sorts of information because he was someone who wanted to include everything, whether he agreed with it or not, in his writing. He's just someone who wanted to cite as much information as possibly could. All right, just wanted to let you know how all these things sometimes work out even now. In case you ever hear about Salman Rushdie, and you probably will, or about the Satanic Verses, inshallah, you'll at least know the story behind it. You can do your own research if you like to as well. It's all on the internet. It's all free and available. So that's it for now. I went 15 minutes over my time, and so I'm probably going to be about 15 minutes late to work. But for now, are there any questions or anything we spoke about right now? I can give you about 5 minutes before I have to leave, inshallah. Any questions? Mayakum. Then next class we'll be going into the conversions of Hamza, and the novel is called, I believe it's called Satanic Verses. That was the name of the novel. It's called the Satanic Verses. That's what the actual name of the book that Salman Rushdie wrote. I'm not encouraging you to go buy the book now, but I don't encourage you to do that. But I also don't believe in hiding from things people say about Islam either. I think we should confront these things head on and tackle them. Wa yakum. We'll speak about the continuing oppression against the Muslims next class, and about the conversion of Hamza and Omar, and that'll bring us into the 6th, probably into the 7th year by then. And then probably become the boycott of the Muslims as well. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, inshallah, we will stop it here.